Thank you. So my name is Ian Saldana, and I am an associate professor here in the Department of Epidemiology in the Center for Clinical Trials and Evidence Synthesis. Welcome to those of you who are online. It's nice to have an in-person seminar. This is kind of rare these days, at least in our center. It's been a while. And welcome to those of you joining on Zoom as well. So this is our monthly seminar for the Center for Clinical Trials and Evidence Synthesis. And today we are very glad to have Professor Paula Williamson join us and to give this seminar. Professor Williamson is a professor at the University of Liverpool in the UK. And she is a professor of medical statistics. Now, her research program is focused on several aspects of evidence-based medicine broadly, including trials, meta-analyses as well, health outcome selection, about which she'll talk about a lot today, and also thinking about waste in research and the environmental impact of research itself. She's an elected fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences as well as the AMS Council. She chaired the UK Medical Research Council, or MRC, network for hubs for clinical trials methodology research in 2008 to 2018, and she successfully led a bid for a new MRC trials methodology research partnership from 2019, bringing together various organizations in the UK. She leads an MRC doctoral training program in trials methodology across 12 research organizations. And perhaps most relevant to her talk today, in 2010, she co-founded the COMET Group, which is the Core Outcome Measures for Effectiveness Trials Initiative, whose goal is to improve the quality and relevance of health research to decision makers, including patients, health professionals, regulators, and policymakers. COMET was the winner of the International Cochrane Reward Prize in 2017 and the inaugural MRC Open Science Impact Prize in 2022. Professor Williamson, as you see there on the title of the slide, will present to us about core outcome sets. What does the future hold? Over to you, Paula. Thank you for doing this and welcome.
Thanks very much for that great introduction. Can everybody hear me all right? Great, thank you. And it's lovely to see some of you that I haven't seen for many years, actually. It's been lovely to catch up. Yeah, so the title actually is one that was given to me largely by Ian. So Ian is actually involved in the COMET initiative. He's on the, I'm just trying to move the slides on. Oh no, okay, so it's a bit slow. Jumping around.
Maybe just
use this one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, now I've worked out how to control the slides. Go back to it. Yes, so I'm delighted to be giving the talk today. So Ian is actually involved in the COMET initiative as well. Recently joined the COMET initiative management group, which I chair. I don't have any other conflicts of interest to declare other than that. So let me just see, it's going to be a bit difficult for those online, but I just wanted to kind of do a little straw poll in the room. If you could just raise your hand if you are new to the ideas of core outcome sets. Okay, a few people. Those who've been involved in the development of a core outcome set. Okay, a few there. People who've used a core outcome set in a primary research study. Okay. And people who've used a core outcome set in a systematic review of studies. Thank you. That's Ian with his hand up. Great. Anyone else had anything to do with core outcome sets? No. Okay, so there's a mix of experience in the room. So forgetting core outcome sets for a moment, thinking about how trialists decide what outcomes to measure in their trials. This was work conducted by Karen Hughes back in 2019. And this is a selection of about 70 or maybe 60 trials that were funded by the National Institute of Health Research in the UK, so the NIHR in the UK. And trialists could tick as many of these reasons and approaches as they had used. And you could see that just over half of the trialists had involved patients or the public in deciding what to measure. But interestingly, you will see that feedback from the funding board, fourth one down, about 1/5 of trialists were persuaded by what the funders suggested they should be measuring. And I'll come back to that later. The bottom one is practitioner opinions, so healthcare practitioners and what they thought should be measured. So there's a range of ways in which people can choose the outcomes that they would measure in those trials. But a common way, I think it was about 40%, was to look at what other trials have measured. So look at the literature, see what people have measured, take notice of it and maybe use it or dismiss it. Now, if you look at that for rheumatoid arthritis, and I'm delighted I could see Bing Bingham from OMERACT on the online, this is what I refer to as an outcome matrix. I started my life as an academic in Liverpool, heavily embedded in the Cochrane collaboration, doing lots of systematic reviews. I would create outcome matrices like this. They are very common to see things like this. Each row is a study. Each column is an outcome. And where there's a Y in the cell, it means that outcome was measured and reported. And where the cell is blank, you don't know if the outcome just wasn't measured or whether the outcome was measured, analysed, and not reported. And the reason sometimes in about 1/3 of trials where an outcome is measured, analysed, and not reported is because the trialist doesn't feel that the results fit with their interpretation of the data. That is a problem referred to as outcome reporting bias, where you choose the results to present in the paper. So you can see that there are several problems. This is not a unique kind of matrix. This happens a lot in the Cochrane systematic reviews that I've been involved in and continues to be an issue. But there's also another issue related to outcomes in trials. There was a review by the Canadian Clinical Guidelines Group, CADITH, back in 2016. On their clinical guidelines groups, they include people with lived experience of the health condition, and they ask those people what matters to them. And they did that in 30 of their clinical guideline projects. And what they found, once they asked those people what outcomes really matter to you, somebody with lived experience of this health condition, what they found was when they mapped what mattered to the patients compared to what was in the primary studies that were being used to inform the clinical guideline, only half of what mattered to patients had actually been measured in any of the clinical guidelines, in any of the primary studies. So there is an issue, or at least there was at the time this work was done, that not every trial, the outcomes that are chosen, not all of them are informed by what matters to patients. So several problems with outcomes. Now that largely relates to what's been measured, but the problem is also there in terms of heterogeneity of how those outcomes have been measured. So this is a diagram showing the results of a systematic review of breast reconstruction following surgery for breast cancer. And the different colours represent the different ways in which an outcome can be measured. So if you look at the top line, symmetry, it was measured in about half of the studies, but it was measured in... So it may have been symmetry measured clinically, photographically, geometrically, or reported by the patients. So there are two problems here: heterogeneity in what is being measured and heterogeneity in how the same outcome domain is being measured. So a potential solution is the development and use of a core outcome set. The concept of a core outcome set isn't new. I think the first core outcome set was actually developed by the World Health Organization in 1970 for cancer trials, very broad in scope. So it's not a new concept, but when we launched COMET in 2010, the definition that we decided upon was this: an agreed standardized set of outcomes that should be measured and reported as a minimum in all clinical trials in specific areas of health or healthcare. I've underlined as a minimum because when we first started talking about core outcome sets, one of the common challenges, and I'm very happy if someone wants to challenge again on this, was that we would be stifling innovation if we made everybody measure the same thing. What we're talking about when we want to promote the use of core outcome sets is the use of a very small number of critical outcomes that matter to decision makers, including patients, and that for a particular trial, there may be other important outcomes as well that should be measured. So this is all about getting that critical core set of outcomes, but we fully expect people to measure other outcomes as well. Following COMET's launch, the SPIRIT guidelines, which are guidance around what should be in protocols and what level of explanation should be given for the methods to be used in clinical trials. There is a reference to consideration of core outcome sets in there. The revised SPIRIT and consort guidelines are due out any minute now, and it's probably being recorded, but I fully anticipate there will be similar recommendations in those updated guidances as well. So let me give you an example of what we mean by a core outcome set. And this was work led from Johns Hopkins. So I saw Victor Dinglass online, and Alison Turnbull's at the back, and Dale Needham, I think, was online as well. So this is a great example of both what we call a core outcome set, agreement over what to measure, and then also a core outcome measurement set, how to measure those outcomes. So here you have an example of 8 core outcome domains with the decisions about how those domains should be measured. Now, some of them have a single measurement instrument, but importantly, not all of them have a currently recommended outcome measurement instrument. And I'm just using this as an example to show that it isn't that easy to do the how stage, okay? There are methods that are well worked up for developing how to gain consensus on what to measure and who to involve in those decisions, but how to decide how to then measure those outcomes relies on there being good work already done on existing measurement instruments. And I'm sure any of you that have ever looked at the literature around instruments that have got into common practice, if you look back and look at how well they were developed, you may find the literature wanting in that respect. But anyway, core outcome set is the what, core outcome measurement set is the how. So hopefully it may be obvious to you that there are several advantages if researchers are starting to use a core outcome set in a particular area of health. And that is that there'll be increased consistency across trials. It'll also maximize the potential for those trials to contribute to systematic reviews. I'm sure there are many systematic reviewers in the audience, and you will have encountered the same problems that I did, that you can't include every trial in a meta-analysis, for example, because they haven't measured the outcomes or they've not reported the outcomes you're interested in. If the appropriate interested parties, stakeholders are involved in deciding what's core, then a core outcome set should be more likely to measure appropriate outcomes. And if there's an expectation that core outcomes are always measured and reported, then at least for those outcomes, it will reduce this problem in selective reporting. So another great example from OMERACT. Now, I chose this outcome matrix, let me go back, not by chance, okay? Those of you that can read on the screen will see that the year of the last publication was 1994. So this is not the full story of trials in a systematic review of disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs for rheumatoid arthritis. These are the trials that were published up to 1994. The outcomes along the top are not actually the outcomes that were chosen by the systematic reviewers. They are actually the outcomes in the core outcome set that was developed by the OMERAC group, who have done fantastic work in rheumatology. So what this graph is showing, those core outcomes are on the right-hand side. The x-axis here is the time, the year, and the y-axis is showing the percentage of trials that measured and reported those core outcomes. Now, this is observational data. Okay, there are 3 vertical lines. The first one is 1995, when the core outcome set was published. So everything before that is reflected in the outcome matrix that I was showing you. Lots of empty cells. So it was only getting to about 40% of trials using the core outcome set. Then the FDA and the EMA endorsed the core outcome set. And is it cause and effect? I don't know. But certainly it's motivating that up to about 2020, and it's carried on since, it's about 85% of trials on measuring and reporting the core outcome set. So we find this to be motivating. It seems to be achieving what we'd like it to achieve. But this is a highly selected example, and I'll come back to that. There is nothing as good as this in terms of core outcome set yet. The important point is look at the time scale. That was published in, that core outcome set was published in 1995, and it took 25 years to get it to increase. That's too long. So this isn't just, COMET isn't just about encouraging people to develop core outcome sets. We absolutely put a focus on how to encourage people to use core outcome sets as well. And if I've not convinced you already, you should be thinking about outcomes carefully and also considering core outcome sets. Then if you look at the recently launched in September of this year, WHO guidance for best practices for clinical trials, you will find on page 16 an endorsement that core outcome sets should be considered for all trials. Okay. So we're delighted that the WHO are endorsing this. We hope that any organisation that endorses core outcome sets feels that they need to, that they are now accountable for people using those core outcome sets, and we're going to be working with the WHO to see how we get on with this as part of their guidance. So if you want to find a core outcome set, where do you go? So this is the, this is the core outcome set website. Top left is a publicly available searchable database of core outcome sets. And then we have lots of other great stuff on there as well, such as videos co-produced with patients about what is a core outcome set, and other sort of news items. How is that database populated? So we do an annual update of a systematic review to find core outcome sets. To date, there's just short of 700 published core outcome sets, but we also register new core outcome set studies. And the point of registration is to try to avoid unnecessary duplication. So we have had examples where groups in different parts of the world have wanted to register a core outcome set for the same health area at the same time. And because they're both registering with COMET, we've managed to put them in touch with each other, and they have worked together collaboratively going forward. Probably doesn't happen as often as it should, and COMET doesn't ever decline to register a project. We prefer to have a comprehensive overview of what's going on. So we wouldn't, if something really is all about developing a core outcome set, we will include it, but we encourage people to make sure they know what's already being done or is ongoing, and that they contact those developers and see if they can work together. So to summarize the health conditions that all of those, over nearly 1,100 core outcome sets, nearly 1,200 core outcome sets, what are the health areas that they're involved in? So as you go from the light grey on the left-hand side through to the dark blue, this is a timeline. So light grey means these were core outcome sets that were published over 10 years ago. sometimes even 20 years ago. The dark blue on the right-hand side are those core outcome sets that are ongoing. And you will see there are a lot of, the x-axis is the number of core outcome sets. As you might expect, because there's a lot of research in the areas of cancer and neurology, there are a lot of core outcome sets that have been developed or are ongoing. There's also a great large number in rheumatology, sort of about a third of the way up, quarter of the way up, and that is thanks to the OMERAT group. They're very active. But interestingly, a few years ago, we noticed that mental health, which is almost right in the middle of the graph, and you'll see it's very light grey at the start, there were very few core outcome sets for mental health conditions, which given the, increasingly we're more aware of mental health, whether it's a mental health condition, mental health alongside a physical health condition, we're really delighted that there has been an increase. You can see on the mental health line, there are many more in dark blue. So there are core outcome sets being developed now. But there are lots of core outcome sets, and sometimes those core outcome sets are sort of related to the same health condition. They have a slightly different scope. So this is work that a colleague from China, from Beijing, Region Q, undertook. She looked at heart failure. There were 4, at the time she did this work, there were 4 core outcome sets for heart failure. The one on the west, core outcome set for heart failure trials. There was one at the south, core outcome set for heart failure practice. One to the east, core outcome set for people with heart failure and preserved ejection fraction, so a subtype of heart failure. And the one at the north, which is a core outcome set for a particular treatment of an acute condition of heart failure. So what you'll see right in the middle are 4 outcomes that are common to all of those 4 core outcome sets: mortality, symptoms, quality of life, and functional or exercise capacity. So what we need is some order in COS development to avoid confusion. Because when people come to the COMET database and they type in heart failure, they find those 4, at least. There are more now. And we want to bring some order and provide some overviews to help people understand how to read these different core outcome sets. So here's an example. This is a fantastic core outcome set for eczema. It was started many years ago by Williamson from the Cochrane Skin Group. They honed in on 4 outcome domains. Over time, they have developed the core outcome measurement set. They actually had to do some primary research to get to those decisions about those instruments. And, it's a small number of outcomes with outcome measurement instruments, and that's what COMET would like to promote the uptake of. About a year ago, we had a request to register a core outcome set for the treatment of eczema using traditional Chinese medicine approaches. And what we said to them was, okay, we understand the interest here, but there is a core outcome set for eczema itself. Might you consider endorsing that and adding on any outcomes that you consider to be core for the traditional Chinese medicine component of treatment? Okay, so this is how we are trying to bring some order now. If we had a blank page when we started COMET, if there'd been no core outcome sets developed, and if we had lots and lots of money, we would have started from core outcome set for the health condition and then adding on modules if there's something specific to a subtype, phenotype, if there's something specific to an intervention type. But we are where we are. There were lots of core outcome sets being developed, but we recognize that we do need to have some sort of overview. And it's very similar, I think, to how Cochrane found itself when they come to this decision about, are we lumping or splitting? Okay, at first it was anybody who wanted to do a systematic review was welcome to do one. I think that's my recollection from 1996. And over time, gaps have been identified, gaps have been filled, and I think there's a bit more structure in terms of the approaches to the systematic reviews. We need that here as well for core outcome sets to avoid the problem that people go to the COMET database and say, there's 10 core outcome sets for asthma. This was a conversation I was having with Janet earlier. What do I do? How do I make sense of this? So that's where we're at. There are other add-on examples. They're not all related to traditional Chinese medicine or Uyghur medicine. There are others for Western medicine, for cesarean scar, dementia and hearing loss. And again, we've managed to convince all of the developers that the core outcome sets for the health condition itself has been well developed, and they should be looking at adding on to that and endorsing the overall overarching core outcome set. What we're doing in response to this growing kind of interest is to restructure the database. We want to have overviews in particular health areas to try to help trialists who come to the database. And also in our registration process, we are making the message stronger about the need to really explain why there is a need for a new core outcome set. It might be because nothing else exists, but if there is something in the area already, why is a new core outcome set needed? And I was chatting to Ian before about whether that might be because the core outcome set that exists is 20 years old and treatments moved on since then, or it was 20 years old and patients weren't asked then, so we need to improve it by asking patients. There are reasons and valid reasons, but we need to be clearer during the registration and make that clear in the database. Okay. As well as the database, COMET has focused very much on trying to develop guidance for how you develop core outcome sets. The COSTAD standards were developed through an international consensus process involving many core outcome set developers and others. There are 11 standards, and really the most, well, in my opinion, one of the most important domains here is whose opinion is determining the core outcome set, who's actually involved in saying what matters. If we look at patients, there is a requirement, if you follow COSTAD, the standards, to include people with lived experience, their carers, or parents, if you're talking about children. So back in 2014, when we did our first review of everything to date, 15% of the cost studies had included patients. Now, by the end of 2023 and ongoing studies, that is over 90%. It's at 94%. It is no longer whether to include patients, but rather the question is how to best include patients. Okay, that's a kind of different talk altogether, but I'll leave that one there. If you think, well, what difference does it make if you include patients? Hard to read, I can see, but this is a categorization of all of the core outcomes in any of those 700 published core outcome sets. The last column is the core outcome sets where patients were involved, and the middle column is where they weren't. And where the biggest difference is, no surprise really, is around the life impact domain, especially functioning, physical functioning, social role, emotional well-being functioning. Where patients are involved, the core outcome set is more likely to include an outcome in those domains. Now, people often ask me, so what's the magic number for the number of core outcomes in a core outcome set? I have no answer to that. However, this is what the number of core outcomes looks like. The x-axis is the year. The y-axis is the number of core outcomes. Blue is where patients were included. Red is where they weren't. This is the median. I was rather hoping it was the mean because we've got some spikes. There are core outcome sets with really large numbers because they are for a scope such as maternity care. Huge. The scope makes a difference here. But I think you'll probably all agree that, you know, a median 6 to 8 means there's a lot of core outcome sets with rather a large number. So a key methodological priority for core outcome set development is how do we make sure people really understand what we mean by core, and that you can't measure everything all of the time. So it's that understanding that we need to get across. I've mentioned that's a methodological question. There are lots of other methodological questions in core outcome set development. We have a taxonomy. There are about 150 method studies that we also have in the database, and they've been classified according to whether they're about the recruitment of patients, whether they're about the consensus methods used, whether it's Delphi, nominal group, whatever. That's, again, it's another talk, which I'm not going to go into, but that information is in the COMET database as well. I mentioned uptake. That rheumatoid arthritis core outcome set is fantastic. It's the best example. What we've been trying to do in COMET is to work out where the levers are. So the top circle is trialists and the influences on those trialists. And clearly funders are a lever. Okay. Indeed, regulators might be as well. As we come around the circle, we're talking clockwise around the circle. We're trying to look at whether users of research, such as systematic reviewers, health technology assessments agencies, and clinical guidelines, whether the users of the research have an influence. So if systematic reviewers choose a core outcome set for their outcomes in their PICO statement, by putting that out there and saying, we want studies that can be included in this systematic review, those studies have used these core outcomes, will that have an influence? And likewise for HTA and clinical guidance. Okay, there is a review article on this is being recorded, but the bottom line of that is that uptake needs improvement. We know from some work, again, that was done by Karen Hughes about the barriers and facilitators. Any of you that are kind of in the behavioral science world, these are very similar if you're talking about sort of any kind of intervention. We need to be able to help trialists appraise core outcome sets. We need to collect use cases for that persuasion argument. I've talked about reducing the number of core domains. I've talked about needing to be able to say how to measure these things. And we need to keep finding where the levers of influence are. So the first one, help for trialists, I'm very grateful to Ian Saldana for helping to put together the sort of framework. Now, although this says framework for comparing the scope of a clinical trial and a core outcome set, and the actual words refer to a review. So Ian developed this for seeing whether systematic review, the scope of a systematic review matched the scope of a core outcome set. But there's a similar framework for clinical trials. I just haven't amended the wording on here. So this is quite useful to know, is there something that matches exactly in terms of the scope, in terms of the population and the interventions covered? Or does it match the population? Is it narrower or broader in the core outcome set? So it's quite a useful tool to use. In the interest of time, I'm going to just speed up a little bit. We have been collecting examples of core outcome set uptake, whether it's using the whole core outcome set, whether it's using a core outcome set when there's not quite an exact match, but there was something relevant and useful that the trial has found, or indeed, even after the grant application was submitted, a core outcome set was published and the trialist responded to it. So all is not lost. Okay. So examples of endorsement by trials groups. The Australian Clinical Trials Alliance have recently endorsed the use of core outcome set. Lots of funders on there, at least one from the US, PCORI. And we recognize that NIH do a lot of work around their core data elements, which is a conversation that we want to continue. Let me jump through here. Ian did this work, led this work about Cochrane systematic reviews. I've talked about the importance of using core outcome sets in trials, but in terms of systematic reviews, back in 2019, before the updated handbook came out, we found that of the first 100 systematic reviews, 7% cited or mentioned a cause in relation to choosing the outcomes in the PICO statement, whereas in fact, when we checked the COMET database, a third could have used a relevant cause. So room for improvement there as well. Then the handbook came out, and then Ian led an updated piece of work in 2022, where we looked at protocols and systematic reviews. And then things have got better. Now, if you're a glass half full, okay, it's over doubled, 90% have cited. So it's on the way up, but there's still room for improvement because nearly half of the reviews could have referred to a core outcome set. Okay, I'm just going to move on from this. So what I'm showing you here is work that we've recently completed. Each of these pie charts, Ian mentioned my interest in environmental impact of the research that we do. each of these pie charts represents a clinical trial. The clinical trial activities have been enumerated. So how many patients, how many outcomes, what data is being collected, data linkage, all of those activities have been enumerated. Carbon emission factors have been found for those activities. Effectively, you multiply them together, you get a number. The overall carbon footprint here for clinical trials generally ranges from anything of the order of 20 tons CO2 emissions through to 2,000, depending on the nature of the trial. The point here is not so much about the number, because there is inaccuracy. There is no gold standard carbon emission factor. The point is the breakdown of where the hotspots are. The dark blue here is trial-specific patient assessments. So it's very commonly one of the highest percentages. It's not the highest, but it's very commonly one of the highest. And what that consists of is both the type of outcome measurements that you might be doing, which might be scans, it might be lab samples taken frequently, it might be PROs that are undertaken on devices that you have given to patients for your trial, and then they cannot be reused because of the regulations. Lots of reasons, but it does also include the travel associated with bringing patients in for those assessments. So I use this as motivation to think very carefully about the outcomes that you choose in your clinical trials. Okay. And of course, that relates to core outcome sets. And why am I mentioning that here? It's because one of the reasons that I'm here is to give this seminar, but the other reason is a 2-day meeting in Washington at the National Academy of Medicine, which is a joint meeting with the Academy of Medical Sciences around environmentally sustainable biomedical research. So this is something that the NHS in the UK, that's the National Health Service, they have made a declaration about the timescale for becoming net zero. And so there's a lot of work being done to try to look at the environmental impact of the healthcare interventions that we deliver. But of course, in our NHS, we also undertake a lot of research. So we also have to look at the environmental impact of that research. Just going to jump through. Okay. So when we talk about environmental impact, it's, of course, you need to start to measure it in order to then look at whether you're managing to reduce it. But importantly, you need to look at the mitigation strategies. There are lots of things that can be done better, but we would make the argument that when it comes to the trial-specific patient assessments, you do not want to be measuring things that don't matter. You do want to be measuring things that matter. You do want to reduce waste, okay? You don't want to be doing studies that increase research waste and therefore increases the environmental impact. You want to make sure that the quality is good. It is common sense, but it's actually surprising how many people are not necessarily taking as much care, specifically around patient assessments, I think. Okay, this is a group. Ian is involved in our MRC Trials Methodology Research Partnership. He co-chairs the Core Outcomes Set subgroup. There's another group in there called the Greener Trials Group. So if anybody is at all interested in looking at the environmental sustainability of clinical trials, it's a growing group. It has international members. At the moment, we can accommodate meetings that are about 12 noon in the UK, which is great for people in the UK, but not so great if you're on the west coast of the States, unfortunately. But anybody is more than welcome to join us in this. That's the people that are involved. So in summary, we know there's lots of evidence. There are issues with measurement and reporting of outcomes in trials. We think, but we would like to be challenged if you don't agree, that core outcome sets offer many advantages if they are available, if they are applicable to your trial, and if robust and transparent methods have been used. I always kind of like to end a talk with something I offer and something I ask. So something I offer is if you're working in a clinical area and you're thinking, oh, I don't want to have to keep checking the COMET database every month to see if there's anything new. We have an alert system. You can go in, you can register if you are interested in type 2 diabetes. If something comes up that's published, you will get an email. If something comes up that's registered and you might want to get involved, you'll get an email. You won't get any other emails. Okay, so, and the challenge, I would like to know, what do you see as the challenges to considering core outcome sets for your own, whether it's PICO for a trial, PICO for a systematic review, PICO for a clinical guideline? What are the challenges that you would see in that? And with that, I will stop there. And by the way, we are, like many other academics, moving from X to Blue Sky. Okay, we're just not quite there yet. We have an account, we just haven't put the thing out that says we've all gone to Blue Sky. All right, thank you very much.
Right. Thank you, Paula, for a great talk and historical perspective, as well as some things for us to think about for the future as well. Okay, let's open it up for questions and discussion, both in person and online. We have our eye online as well, so if you have a question, please raise your hand or type it in the chat and we'll get to it. But let me start with in the room. I think I spotted Karen's hand. I think Williamson, so just introduce yourself and
Thank you, Ian. Karen Williamson. I have a number of questions and comments, but I'll just ask one here. In terms of uptake of the outcome sets, you showed that really impressive figure about the uptake for one specific outcome set, and perhaps being driven by the regulators endorsing or mandating the outcome set. Do you know what proportion of the outcome sets have been endorsed by FDA or EMA?
So I know that the EMA have referenced 2 core outcome sets. We've not systematically gone through and looked at the rest. The reason I know about that is because when COMET was first funded by the EU, we were delighted to welcome onto our advisory board Irmgard Eichler, who worked at the EMA. And her recommendation was when the EMA publishes a consultation document around guidance for clinical trials, what they do when they get to the outcomes bit is just to look at the literature. Okay, it's not their opinion. They're looking at the literature, and they said, if you've got the literature about core outcome sets in your COMET database, write a response to the consultation, tell us what it is. And on both of those 2 occasions that we were able to do that from COMET, they're both in the guidance. One is actually pediatric asthma, which I was delighted because we were kind of involved in the work. So was the American Thoracic Society, but and I think there's one on COPD as well. But that's quite resource intensive for COMET. So now what we try to do, we get alerts and we try to put that alert out to the core outcome set developers themselves. This is one of the things that's really important for core outcome set developers to appreciate, that just publishing a brilliant piece of work isn't enough. You'll know that from lots of clinical guideline work and everything. I don't know about the FDA. What I do know is the FDA have actually funded what I would call a core outcome set, but they use slightly different terminology, and that's absolutely fine. There were 2 pilot projects funded a couple of years ago. I don't think they've finished yet. But I haven't actually looked at FDA guidance, and I don't know how they decide. I don't know if they have a similar process to EMA. I presume they have a consultation process as well. I'm sure there's more we could do.
right, let's go online. I see Bing has a hand up. Go ahead, Bing.
Hi, Paula. Thank you so much. Nice to see you. I'm sorry I can't come over to see you in person. Just a follow-up to the comment and question that was just raised. I think one of the things that really moved the adoption of the rheumatoid arthritis core set forward was that the elements within the core set were actually combined to develop a clinical outcome assessment itself. It wasn't that just these individual things were measured, but that each of them provided information that went into a composite outcome assessment that was endorsed by the American College of Rheumatology and by the European League Against Rheumatism as a global standard for clinical trial outcomes. Given that you have to record all of the things that are in the core set to get that responder index, that was what led, I think, the regulators to really come on board and adopt, seeing that the international organizations had come together to endorse this particular outcome measurement. So I do think that endorsement of the core set by organizations such as professional organizations that can influence both pharmaceutical companies as well as regulators to adopt these elements, if those go into constructing a composite outcome assessment, that may speed up their utilization. And I think that is really what was responsible for that uptick, with the RA core set.
I'm sure, well, you know the history better than I do, Bing. I think that may be sensible in some areas, but for others, I mean, you talk about chronic diseases here, but for others, I don't think a composite would necessarily be the way to go. But I think the crucial thing is about getting that agreement about a small number. What I was going to say, interestingly, is that I think the FDA offer this, but certainly the EMA offer this. If you are prepared to pay £50,000, they will validate, or you can go through their validation process. So they do that typically for a patient-reported outcome measure, and they've offered to commit that they could do the same for a core outcome set. And I think that's quite interesting, because I'm not quite sure what validation of a core outcome set actually means, because we have methods for development, and then by and large, proof of the pudding is in the eating, or people actually using it. So I don't know if you've had any experience being in that validation exercise with the regulators, or whether they were just simply happy at the time to say, this looks great, we'll take it on.
Yeah, I think, we get some sense of this from the patient-focused drug development work that the FDA has published on, in terms of defining a clinical outcome assessment, based on a concept of interest that is derived, from patients. And then this is especially in terms of patient-reported outcomes, constructing that concept in a way that an outcome measure would be reflective of the things that went into that. And then you can have composite, patient-reported outcomes, for instance, that would reflect back on that original concept of interest. So that's sort of the way that I see sort of, a composite measure coming together, under sort of their current structure. But, again, that's been more in relationship to patient-reported outcomes rather than ClinROs or PerfROs.
Yeah.
Thanks, Bing. Other thoughts or questions in the room? Paula, one question or request that I have of you is whether you can say a little more about to the extent that you can, about your meeting in DC this week and what that's about, and also whether, because as I mentioned, there's the Center for Clinical Trial Services at the Data Coordinating Center for Numerous Trials. Are there things that our center, data coordinating centers, can think about in terms of the environmental impact work of clinical trials that you're focused on?
Sure. So the meeting that I'm going to, the UK government funds international policy projects, and they funded the Academy of Medical Sciences to run an international policy project with the National Academy of Medicine, actually under the broad umbrella of climate change and health. So what we've done is, the National Academy of Medicine had a process of selecting, I think there's 9 individuals, emerging research leaders they're referred to, and as did we in the Academy. So they're not Academy Fellows, but they are emerging research leaders. And over the past 9 months, those 18 individuals have got together. They met in London, and then this is the final meeting in person. We've been meeting online in between. And they've been, first of all, learning about how to develop policy, because many of them are great researchers, but not necessarily understanding necessarily how that then translates into policy recommendations. Some are actually involved in climate change research as well. So they've coming together. They've gone into 4 subgroups looking at different aspects. They've all focused in on what they all have in common, which is research. So they want to look at the environmental impact of the research that they do, whether it's lab research, clinical trials, use of AI, whether it's AI as part of healthcare intervention. And the meeting is to see how they're getting on. We have speakers from the US and also from the UK. And there will be a report with policy recommendations that are, they should be a combined set of policy recommendations rather than specific to the UK, specific to the US, but let's see how we get on in March.
The second part of that, thoughts.
How you might get involved? Sure.
About, I mean, the environmental impact of trials.
Yeah, sure. So I was talking earlier with Janet about kind of remote decentralized trials. I was talking with Alison about decentralized trials, but then the potential conflict with inclusivity, participation. I think there are some things that look to be no-brainers in terms of what can be done, okay? Not all trial team meetings need to be in person, in my opinion, okay? So a lot can be online. I think there are other things that will need regulatory guidance. So I mentioned this reuse of devices that are given out to trial participants that they will have no use of afterwards. Can they be reused? The regulators, at least in Europe, I don't know about here, they have issues with doing that. There are things about if you're doing investigation drug trials, about relabeling, repackaging, moving from one hospital to a nearby hospital so you don't lose, so the product doesn't go out of date and you'll just lose it. There's issues about central labs rather than local labs. Can you skill up local labs? So you don't have to fly samples around the world. I think there are quite a lot of things to do, but there's also a lot of research that still needs to be done. I think the issues, particularly I was talking this morning about trying to recruit participants online or remotely or by letter is challenging. It might have a lower carbon impact, but it might adversely affect recruitment, which then prolongs the trial, which then has actually an adverse effect on the environment. So lots of research still to be done, I think, but there are methods. There's a life cycle analysis approach, which it sounds very fancy to me, but it's actually just a mathematical calculation of activity and carbon emission factors. The difficulty is in the carbon emission factors.
Thank you, Paula. I see Bing has posted a link in the chat, but maybe I'll just read it
Okay.
out.
Oh yes,
FDA patient-focused drug development guidance series. Might be of interest. So,
absolutely. And wherever we see these, we include them in the COMET database. What I didn't say was the COMET database doesn't just include published core outcome sets, registered core outcome sets. In our systematic review, inevitably we find other things such as qualitative literature about what matters to patients, such as the FDA PFDR, sorry, and systematic reviews of outcomes. So that's, as much as we know, it's not necessarily comprehensive, but we always put that in to the database for core outcome set developers to make use of.
Other thoughts and questions or comments?
Oh, I
Yes,
have a
Jen.
question for you, Tom.
Yes.
Good job with the mic. On the Zoom, I've always been on the other end. I hope people can hear the questions. So my question was about, like a core outcome set for safety issues and drug trials, because it seems like we're having to measure behavioral depression, suicidality, almost in every drug we test, there's some signal. Maybe it's just the background population. And any comments on whether there are those that are developed or being developed?
Great question, very topical. So when we've reviewed the core outcomes in existing published core outcome sets, about a third have a statement that says, and you should always consider adverse effects. About another third specifically identify specific harms that should be included. I think there's a real mix of how core outcome set developers are approaching this question. And I think it relates to the scope, because if you're talking about a core outcome set for eczema, then at least in my experience, the decision about whether you'll focus on specific adverse effects and how you will collect those data is a decision that you make at the trial level. So that core outcome set for eczema is largely benefit outcomes, with an expectation that if you use that in a trial, you will follow regulatory guidance and always report serious adverse effects, SUSARs, etc. It's very topical because I know that the Cochrane Adverse Events Methods Group, is that the right term? So we know that harms are underreported, not well reported, and there needs to be a focus on that. The challenge has been set for core outcome set developers. What does that mean? What should we be doing? Is it enough to say, here's the benefit outcomes that you should always be measuring, and don't forget harms in your specific trial? Is that enough? I don't know if you have a view, Jan. It is an open question.
You know, I've had the interesting experience lately is that I thought in my career that I had been taught that the bad way to do it was just to ask open-ended questions, and it was better to really just ask people, did you have headache? Did you have nausea? Ask everybody the same set of questions. And I'm coming to the other end of my career, and people want to do that again. And people that I kind of respect, and that would really. And I don't know, that seems like antithetical to core outcomes. So maybe I can use that as an argument. But do you have any reaction to whether it should be open-ended or specific?
So I do think it depends on your trial question. So I mentioned that most of my trials work has been in anti-epileptic drugs, head-to-head treatments of drugs that have been on the market with a license for several years, where the side effects are well known. So what you're really looking for are the unexpected side effects. We've got more than enough information about weight gain on lamotrigine. So in terms of trying to focus on the really important data and not spend time in the NHS where we've done our trials that we don't necessarily have, the decision is made at the trial level, what outcomes to collect and what to focus on. And we wouldn't collect known adverse effects. We would collect SAEs and SUSARs in that, but not going through a list of things. It would be, has the patient been hospitalized, had a life-threatening incident? So I just think it has to be trial specific as to what and how. But
Yeah, thank
you. Any maybe a last minute comment or question? No. All right, let's wrap up there. Bing has added another point in the chat that Omrak is a working group that's attending to this issue. Professor Williamson, thank you so much for doing this, and thanks everyone for joining in person and online. Those in person, there's still leftover food in the back, so please get some. take some to go. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day and the holidays coming up. Take care.